Today we will be looking at Unit 5.5, the Ottomans. This will be our last new information in Unit 5 on Asia in the Middle Ages. Our key questions today are: who are the Ottomans? How did they gain power and territory? Why did the Ottomans decline or end? And what impact did the Ottomans have on the rest of the world? So our first question is, who are the Ottomans? The Ottomans are named after their leader Osman, who's an early Turkish leader. They are a Turkish group. They were nomadic, but as they expand their empire, they will transition into a sedentary culture. Defining what it means to be Turkish can be a little bit difficult. It's mostly a language group or an ethnic group. Over time, they would conquer Anatolia. Anatolia is this geographic region right here. Today, we would think of that as Turkey, named after the Turks who will control it. Prior to today's lecture, we have thought of this as the Byzantine Empire or Eastern Roman Empire, and at times Persian Empire. As they conquer this area and eventually overthrow the Byzantine Empire, they're going to be surrounded by Byzantium and then later independent European kingdoms to the north and west, and then to the south and southeast, you will see them surrounded by Muslim kingdoms and empires. A couple of our most important leaders in the Ottoman Empire would include Sultan Mehmet II. Sultan is the title of an Ottoman leader. They are the Sultan. We've talked about this Muslim term before with the Sultanate of Delhi. There was a Sultan of Delhi. If you look, Mehmet is in power 1451 to 1481. So to give some perspective, this is just before, say, Columbus would sail for America in 1492. And we're at the end period for the Byzantine Empire. It has shrunken and shrunken and shrunken pretty consistently since 1000 or so, when they will be attacked in the era of the Crusades. And so Mehmet will be the leader who really takes control of Anatolia. Anatolia is an incredibly valuable geographic area to have, both economically and militarily. And so this is the point where the Turks will take that, ultimately the end of the Byzantine Empire. They will capture the former Byzantine capital, the capital known as the city of Constantinople. We've seen that, images of that, looked at, say, that Hagia Sophia, the famous church there. When they conquer it, they will change the name, and it will become Istanbul. That is the name that will stay with that city until today. And we saw how they would build their own mosque, but they would also turn church like the Hagia Sophia into a mosque. The Turks will encourage migration into the city. They are very cosmopolitan, very tolerant, very economically prosperous. So it was a place a lot of people wanted to go. And we see a pretty strong migration, for example, of Jews from Eastern Europe. Jews are historically mistreated in Eastern Europe. We'll talk about that more down the line in this class. But a lot of them will come and settle for the freedom of religion that they could practice in the security in the Ottoman Empire. Remember, this would fit in that diaspora, the spreading out of the ethnic and religious group of the Jews. Here you can see an example of the scale and opulence. This would have been the bedchamber. Note how big this room is, how elaborate. So this is just showing you the wealth and power of these sultans. Here you can see a map that would show you Ottoman lands, right? They start gaining territories in this green, dark green area, right? Gaining more and more here when they will capture Constantinople, and then over time further and further to areas including Egypt and most of North Africa. Also note, it will move its way well into Europe. This doesn't last very long, but it is a true threat to Central and Eastern Europe, this Ottoman Empire. The other major leader we need to know is Suleiman the Magnificent. Suleiman also has the name the Lawgiver, and he's probably our most powerful and important of the Ottoman emperors. He continued that war and conquest, again, particularly expanding, as we just saw, into North Africa and Europe. He codified laws You should be getting used to seeing that. We've seen that over and over. Hammurabi, 12 Tables, Justinian, how important it is to codify or write down those laws. There's a cultural explosion within the Ottoman Empire. Again, it's very cosmopolitan and diverse. The Ottoman Empire had a lot of wealth, had a lot of diversity, and so this really created an atmosphere for writing, poetry, art, and science and academia, as well as architecture. They'll build palaces. We already saw one of the bedchambers of a sultan. Mosques, we saw where they added onto the Hagia Sophia. Libraries, hospitals, roads. Very prosperous model empire, particularly in the early stages in the 14 and 1500s. They will begin to use the title caliph purposefully as they become more and more embedded in Islam as a reference back to that early caliph system that would include Muhammad. Here you can see the Suleiman Mosque. Note the very traditional spires, right, that we think of with mosques around the city of Istanbul. And here's the inside again. Think about your scale here, much like when we looked at the Hagia Sophia. So, a couple main characteristics to keep in mind when we think about Ottoman rule. It was diverse, lots of ethnic groups, languages, religions, and it was generally tolerant. For the most part, the solution was anyone who was a non-Muslim, which was the official state religion, Islam, if you were a non-Muslim, you paid a tax, and then otherwise, you could practice however you want. Now, again, in America today, we would not necessarily see that as freedom of religion or tolerance, but compared to other empires of the time, which would have had very harsh policies, we'll talk about some of those when it comes to Europe in our next unit of study, this would have been a very welcoming place for people with diverse backgrounds.
Pardon the interruption.
The Ottomans also had a strong centralized bureaucracy. We have talked about these terms over and over and over. The system of government officials, the career officials who make all the decisions, higher up people in government, who put them into action. These large empires would have had thousands of them. Ottomans were very centralized. We know that means the capital and the sultan and the central government had a lot of power, as opposed to something like the Mongols, where tribal leaders had a lot of power in the Confederacy, or in the feudal Japanese or European system, where individual landowners, daimyo or lords, that nobility would have had a lot of power. And if you think back, the geographic region the Ottomans hold, Anatolia, has had a long history of strong centralized model bureaucracy. The Persian Empire back in the ancient world, Byzantine Empire, and then now the Ottomans. The Ottomans had massive infrastructure projects, roads, bridges, things like that for communication across a large empire. Unique to the Ottomans was this policy of devshirme. The Ottomans, in an attempt to make sure that none of the hereditary landed nobility, the people who are rich landowners, lords, nobility by birth, can become too powerful. They want to keep that power centralized. So instead of having their sons, right, the younger nobles, become government officials and leaders, like many places that like European feudalism would do, or we talked about China. China would have a test system. You literally took a test, a placement test, basically, to see what jobs you could get. The Ottomans will do this by basically kidnapping people. They'll kidnap Christians, particularly from Eastern Europe, but kidnap children from other places as well when they were very, very young, and they would raise these orphans and train them. And keep in mind, this means these young men would be completely loyal to the Sultan and later the Caliph, right? They have no family loyalties. They have no connections to anybody who might want them to have power. And so they're really, truly loyal to the ruler. And so they would be trained into one of two things. The top 10% would go into civil service training, would be a bureaucrat, would be a government leader and official. And the rest would join the military, particularly this, what was called the Janissary Corps. The Janissary Corps was an elite military unit, the way we would think about the Green Berets, the Rangers, the Navy SEALs, those kinds of things. So what happens to the Ottomans? Very similarly, I would argue, to what we see with the Byzantine Empire, is they have a long, slow decline. Some of that from leadership. I give the example of Selim II, whose nickname was Selim the Sloth. If your nickname is Sloth, it doesn't really bode well for your leadership abilities, I don't think. There'll be a lot of corruption. Remember, all that wealth can be very tempting for corruption. The Janissaries, over hundreds of years, this Janissary Corps starts gaining more and more power and wanting more and more hereditary rights, possibilities, and strengths in the society. Think kind of the way we saw eunuchs, a unique group in China, having lots of political intrigue and ambitions. People resented really heavy taxes, and again, so you'll see that in the form of peasant revolts. And you'll see a decline in intellectualism. Over time, we're going to see the Middle East and Muslim communities make a turn toward conservatism, much like what we saw in the European Dark Ages from Christianity, where they really reject a lot of modernity, a lot of science, a lot of technology, a lot of urbanization as a challenge to their religion. In the Middle East, Islam; in the European Dark Ages, Christianity. And so we see a period of decline out of an area that had been a leader in science, technology, astronomy, engineering, etc. Some other reasons we see problems for the Ottomans. A major one is the age of exploration. If you look at the maps up here in the age of exploration, we'll be talking about this in a couple units, Europe starts finding alternative ways to trade. Here is Anatolia. It was the Persian Empire for a while, Byzantine, and now Ottoman. It was right at the crossroads. All trade had to pretty much come through here at some point, and this made the Ottomans a lot of money. Europeans start getting tired of having to pay these heavy taxes to the Ottomans, so they start exploring. Portuguese will find their way around Africa, get to the spice trade of India and China on their own, and as we know, Columbus will leave from Spain up here and make his way to the New World. Now, his purpose was to try to get to Asia, again, to bypass the Ottomans. So that's a problem. The Spanish will bring back a lot of silver and gold and wealth. This creates a lot of inflation. So there's a lot of problems that come out of the New World and Age of Exploration. Another significant problem that the Ottomans are going to have, especially by the 17 and 1800s, is rising nationalism. Nationalism is the concept that people identify with a common culture, language, history, etc. And remember, we talked about how diverse the Ottoman Empire was. Lots of language, lots of religion, lots of ethnicities. By the 17 and 1800s, more and more the Turks are wanting their country to be Turkish. They're wanting it to be Turkish to be the language, Islam to be the religion, only Turks to be there, to be led, only leaders be Turkish. This is a very common movement happening in the 1800s throughout Europe and Europe's neighbors. We'll see it in the late 1800s in China. And this makes it hard. Any empire or country that is multinational, has a lot of diversity, is going to have challenges from groups who want to be nationalists, who want one defining identity for their population. Officially, the Ottoman Empire doesn't end until 1922, so it's going from the 1400s to the 20th century. It has been in decline for a lot of that. Again, very similar to the Byzantine Empire in the same location. The ultimate end is they choose the wrong side in World War I. They will be allies with the Central Powers, right? Germany and Austria-Hungary. Germany and Austria-Hungary lose World War I. As part of the punishment, all the losers' empires, German Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Ottoman Empire, are broken up. And so this will be broken up into lots of different states. The most Turkish one will be called Turkey. And even though they didn't like losing the war, many of those nationalists actually liked the fact that the empire was split up and they now had a nationalist nation, a nation state full of Turks. We will come back to and talk about this part of Turkish history later in this course. Main leader is Kemal Ataturk, and we see nationalism and secularism, non-religious government. Still religious people, Muslim country, but is secular, much like you would think of Europe or the United States. Here you can see the Mehmed VI, the last Ottoman emperor, leaving in 1922. Here, our last summary of why Ottomans are so